Hello, friends. Welcome to the Kidmin Podcast. I'm your host, Kenny Conley, and I'm so excited to have you here for episode 10. This is a milestone for us, and welcome. For the last several episodes, we've been focused on Vacation Bible School. It's about that time of year when we start planning and preparation. So it's all too right that we be having these conversations right now. And I've loved the conversations we've been having. They've been helpful, they've been inspiring, they've been encouraging. But today we're going to wrap up our conversation about VBS, and I want to have an honest conversation about Vacation Bible School. Maybe we'll call this the skeptical VBS podcast. Now, I just think it's going to be important to have real conversations because maybe you're wrestling, maybe you're on the fence as to why or why not my church should even do VBS. So here, let me tell you a little bit of my perspective. I've been in ministry for 26, 27 years, and there have been more years in my ministry that I didn't do VBS than years that I did. And you know what? I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. It's not like I discovered VBS recently. I did VBS at multiple times in my ministry. I've worked at churches where VBS wasn't really a part of the culture. For some churches where I worked, VBS was one of the biggest events of the year. And both approaches worked. They worked. It depended on the church we were at. And so that leads us to the question, and maybe the question you've been wrestling with is, should churches do VBS? Should my church do VBS? And you got to ask the question, why should your church do VBS? Let's be real honest. VBS is iconic. Okay, it's iconic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a necessary thing. I think that Vacation Bible School, and we all know this, is probably the most recognizable kids ministry program in the West, in the United States. Literally millions of kids, millions upon millions of kids have attended VBS at some point in time. So many adults, they trace their faith story back to VBS. Just, last episode, we had our guest, Dan Pollock, and he shared about how he met Jesus at a VBS when he was just 5 or 6 years old. And that experience played a part in his pathway towards ministry. So stories like this, they matter, and which attributes that VBS matters. It has a place to belong. But just because something's iconic doesn't mean it's automatically strategic. Okay? Churches shouldn't do VBS just because the church has always done it, or because every other church does it, or because the parents in your church ask you about it, or they expect it. It's one of those things, and I know I'm probably going to take some criticism for saying this, but just 20, 30 years ago, children's ministry existed almost exclusively as Sunday school in most local churches. But 30 years later, it's not that Sunday school is gone, but some of the most dynamic, leading, growing churches, Sunday school is not a part of the children's ministry experience. And so it leads to the question that although VBS has been around for 100 years, I don't really know how long VBS has been around, but is it something old, or is it something that's out of date? I don't think so, but maybe it depends on the place, the church, how it's executed. So here's the question: is VBS, is it still strategic? Is it still a strategic ministry tool? Or at your church, is it becoming a relic of the past? Is it something that's just been done? And I think that's something that every church has to wrestle with. Here's actually some of the questions that I think I've wrestled with about VBS and why at some of the churches I worked at, we didn't do it, okay? VBS can be an amazing ministry tool, but it comes with challenges sometimes. For example, it can be a distraction from the weekly ministry. Every single week, Sunday is coming, another opportunity to teach the gospel and to build relationships with kids, to lead your volunteers. And if you're not careful, VBS can become like the biggest thing you do all year. And that doesn't always necessarily translate to 51 weeks of discipleship. Sometimes sometimes it can get in the way of things. Like sometimes VBS, I've seen this happen before. It can burn your staff out. It can burn your volunteers out. It's months and months of preparation and long hours and this massive volunteer push to make this thing happen. And then the weeks after VBS, everybody's recovering. And so it just ends up sometimes being a distraction to the weekly ministry of your church. VBS also can be very expensive, like very expensive. I mean, some churches spend thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to execute their VBS, from the curriculum, the decorations, the supplies, the events, the t-shirts, all the stuff, the production. It can cost a lot. And you got to ask the question, is this the most strategic way we should spend our resources? I know some churches, their VBS budget is larger than the budget that they use to spend to do ministry the rest of the year. And sometimes another thing that you got to wrestle with, and the way that VBS can be a negative, is that it focuses more on the spectacle than that long-term impact. Like we sometimes get overwhelmed by the themes and the decoration and the production of it all, and you end up creating this thing that is completely disconnected from what you do every weekend. And I would argue that things that matter most are the relationships and discipleship and the gospel conversations that happen on a weekly basis in our churches. So those are things that I think you have to watch out for, and maybe it's worth evaluating. Like, have those things been true of my church? Of when we do VBS, the weeks leading up to VBS, the weeks after VBS are not great because VBS just is so consuming. But it doesn't change the fact that VBS, it might be one of the best things your churches does all year long, or at all. Despite these challenges, VBS can be incredibly powerful. One of the things that I oftentimes say to parents and to leaders is that VBS sometimes is a catalytic spiritual moment. It creates an environment where really beautiful things happen. For a lot of kids, VBS is where they heard the gospel clearly. I mean, some kids, they don't come every weekend, and so it might take 3 or 4 weeks or 3 or 4 months for kids to hear a story, because it's a week in between each time. The message, they don't remember it all, but when a kid comes to VBS 4 days in a row or 5 days in a row, it might be the clearest message of the gospel that they've ever heard. And so many kids encounter Jesus, they hear the gospel clearly. And for so many kids, it's where they begin their faith journey. Dan's example, his story was an example of that. And so that's an amazing reason to do VBS. VBS oftentimes is just this incredible on-ramp for families. Families find out about your church because their child gets invited by a friend, and VBS is such an easy way for a family to approach your church and connect with your church. And maybe there's families that they'd be really reluctant to attend on a Sunday service, but they might send their kids to VBS. And so it's a great doorway to faith and to community and to church. And it becomes a really great first connection for the church. And, this is one of the reasons why I love VBS, is VBS is a volunteer magnet. So many people sign up to serve in VBS, people that maybe don't have the time to make a regular weekly commitment to serving your kids ministry, but they sign up for VBS because they remember what VBS was for them, and they save time every summer to make time to serve at VBS. So it's kind of a volunteer magnet. So many people sign up to serve for VBS who don't serve the rest of the year. And so it's a great opportunity to connect with people who could end up becoming long-term ministry volunteers. And this is something that Jeremy said in one of our conversations about VBS, is that VBS oftentimes can be a leadership laboratory. It's an opportunity to develop leaders, to give leaders more responsibility, to put them on a pathway towards leadership. And so it's an opportunity for people to communicate and to lead teams and take initiative and care for kids in a way that's a little bit more unique than the weekly routines that we have as doing ministry every weekend. And so it kind of becomes this opportunity to test and see and experiment and give leaders opportunities to grow and see what they're made of. And last of all, VBS can be a ministry accelerator. It can build momentum for your ministry in a way that nothing else can. Because in 1 week, your kids build relationships and they experience spiritual growth and they experience just this ministry energy that they don't get at other times. So like sometimes VBS, it feels like a year's worth of ministry packed into just a handful of days. So that's really amazing. So you got some cons and you got some pros. So the question to ask is, why does your church do VBS? Or why should your church do VBS? And before you dive into planning for VBS this year, you should ask yourself these deeper questions. What's the purpose of a VBS? Like at the end of the day, what do you hope to achieve by your VBS? What's it trying to do? Okay, different churches might answer this question differently, and one question is not right where the other ones are wrong. It just depends on your church. For some churches, VBS might be all about outreach. It's an opportunity to reach new families. I remember years ago, 20 years ago, I would do VBS, and I did it in a strategy where we would close down registration when we hit a certain number because we wanted to make sure we had plenty of room for guests. And then we mobilized kids. We created some incentives around prizes and rewards and a big party. And we incentivized kids to invite their neighbors and their friends from school. And we would see VBS attendance grow by 30-40% from Monday to Friday because it was an outreach. It was an opportunity for kids to invite their friends to come to VBS. So is outreach the strategy? Or it might be discipleship. It's an opportunity that you've got 5 days in a row or 4 days in a row to really go deeper content-wise and wrestle with topics that you want kids to really understand. And, it's fine if neighborhood kids come, but it's really an opportunity to take your kids on a gospel journey, a discipleship journey. And that's great. Or maybe it's about relationships. You're wanting to leverage this extra time to help kids grow deeper connections with their peers, maybe for your small group leaders to build deeper relationships with your kids. So VBS could be about any of those things, and you just have to know what it is for you. Like, what is the motivation for doing VBS at your church? None of those answers are wrong, but your strategy, it should match your goal, okay? If the goal is outreach, design a VBS that's perfect for guests, for first-time guests. If the goal is discipleship, emphasize small groups and relationships through your VBS, okay? But here's the kicker, okay? This is the worst reason to do VBS. Do you want to know what it is? The worst reason to do VBS is because you've always done it, okay? Tradition alone is not a strategy. And I know it can be nostalgic. It can be comforting, comfortable. It's just what we do. And I'll just say this: if VBS, if it doesn't fit your mission, like you got options. Like if your church has changed or you've got new people on the team, you have an opportunity to reinvent it, redesign it. You can rename it. You don't have to call it VBS, or even replace it with something better for your context. See, the goal isn't to protect a program or to protect something that's been done for decades. The goal is to reach kids and families with the gospel. The goal is to disciple the next generation. The goal is to build relationships, not to protect a program. Don't do VBS just because you've always done it. See, VBS, Vacation Bible School, has shaped countless faith stories. It's iconic, but the goal of children's ministry is not to run great programs. It's not to run VBS. The goal is to help kids and families follow Jesus. And if VBS helps your church do that, then double down, like do that really well. But if something else would help your church do it better, then have the courage to kill your VBS and create something else instead. So whichever way you lean and whichever way you plan to go, I just want to encourage you, like, do what makes sense. Have the hard conversations. And you may not be in a position where you can actually make that decision, but challenge your leadership, challenge your volunteers, challenge your parents. Is this the right decision for our church? Is this the right way for us to go? Is there something we can do differently? Or do we need to double down and do this in a different, unique way to continue to reach kids and families for Jesus? I love VBS. I have so many amazing memories, but you know what? I'm going to do what works and what makes the biggest difference for our volunteers and for our kids and for our families. And so wrestle with that. So should your church do VBS? I don't know. That's for you to figure out and for you to decide. I hope this spurs great conversations between you and your leadership. And at the end of the day, I hope it causes you to lead better vacation Bible school programs or innovate to what your church and what your ministry needs to do next. Well, thanks for this conversation. It's so great having these kinds of conversations, sometimes honest conversations and hard conversations. Thanks for joining me again on our podcast. Look forward to being with you again in our next episode, and we'll see you in the next week.